Crossover Breakers is going to be the next Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG set, releasing on December 6th, which is only a few weeks away. I wanted to make this video to give you a quick preview into what the metagame could potentially look like once the set is released, so you can get a better idea of what to expect from this set, as well as gain a better understanding of what some of the decks introduced in this set will do. So without any further ado, let's get into it. So in Crossover Breakers, there are going to be 3 new archetypes, being Ryzeal, Maliss, and Ryu-Ge, and in this video I'm going to be going over a high-level overview of what you can expect from these decks. It's not meant to be an in-depth guide to any of them by any means, but just to give you an idea of what to expect in this upcoming metagame and what some of these decks can do, plus how they'll end up impacting the meta overall. So starting off with the very first deck, I'm going to be talking about Ryzeal. So Ryzeal as a deck is a rank 4 Xyz deck and plays sort of a mid-rangey style of game, controlling the pace of the game with a bunch of hand traps and ending on a few different disruptions. The main card in their deck is going to be Ryzeal Detonator, so the Xyz monsters you see on the left. This card will allow them to destroy a card every time another card is activated, and can give protection to their other Xyz monsters, which is pretty important in some of their combos. And the way this deck works is they have a bunch of these level 4 monsters that can always be free special summons, and will get them to the other monsters in their deck to help them Xyz climb into these different rank 4s. They also have a few spells and traps like the Ryzeal Hole Thruster you see on the right, which can act as an additional interruption or extenders. So overall, it is pretty much what you'd expect out of a Xyz turbo deck. Tons of extenders and tons of 1-card starters, plus a few spell and trap cards to help support the overall strategy. So what can this deck actually do? What I have here is a potential endboard that they can end on. I think with Ryzeal, the endboard is a little bit more defined than some of these other decks, but this is still just meant to be a example of what they can do. It's not meant to say like this is all they can do or this is what they're always going to go for. But essentially, when you play against Ryzeal and they go off uninterrupted, you can expect something like 2 to 3 pops off of their Detonator, plus their Field Spell, which essentially gives them a monster negate as long as they have a material to detach from an Xyz monster. They also have the ability to make generic rank 4s like Traptor Strafflesia, which can actually send Ryzeal Hole Thruster to the graveyard, which is pretty nice, but they can also substitute this for other generic rank 4s like Tornado Dragon or Abyss Dweller if the situation calls for it. And this is a deck that has a lot of 1-card starters, so you can expect to see a ton of hand traps as well, plus a solid amount of follow-up through their engine. So overall, like I mentioned, it is a pretty mid-rangey style of play, but I think the most impressive part about these endboards is that they can be made with just a single card, so you likely will have to face down more non-engine on top of all this, which can make the deck pretty scary. Now, how would you actually go about beating this deck? Here I have a few of the cards that have been seeing play in the OCG and that have been proven to be pretty good, but this is by no means an exhaustive list of all the possible cards that are going to be good against this deck. It's just meant to give you an idea of what you can expect to see be played against this deck once it comes to the TCG. The biggest card is going to be Ultimate Slayer. You can see their endboard is essentially full of Xyz monsters, and being able to deal with the Detonator off a single card, and then using Meteorologic Aggregator to negate either their field spell or another rank 4 on the field can be incredibly strong, and hence why it's seeing so much play in the OCG. The fact that a single card can almost single-handedly break their entire board is really nice. There isn't really a great way for the Ryzeal deck to actually stop this card. So that's pretty much why, in a nutshell, Ultimate Slayer is being played. Some hand traps that are good against Ryzeal, Multurmy Purulia is pretty good. They do spam out a lot of monsters from their hand in order to keep extending and doing their combo. I've listed Purulia here instead of Fuulos because the thing with this deck is technically, yes, Fuulos is always going to allow you to draw one because they have to commit to an Xyz monster, but they can just pass on Detonator if they really have to, and Detonator with just 2 monsters is essentially 2 pops, which is still pretty solid through a Fuulos, so I feel like Purulia would be a tiny bit better for that. But another hand trap you could also consider is Droll and Lockbird. Now in their combo, a lot of their 1-card starters are going to involve searching another monster in some way, or they're using a spell card like Bonfire to get to their 1-card starter, so cutting them off of the searches after that is pretty good because they do have an Xyz monster which allows them to detach 2 materials and essentially search 2 Ryzeal cards from their deck to the hand, which is something that they're always going to do in their combo, and that means you'll cut off something like extension from their equip spell or a negation from their field spell and disruption from their trap card. But in general, the Ryzeal deck is fairly resilient to most hand traps, and hence makes it fairly hard to deal with even if you do see some of these better ones against them. But a card that will almost completely shut them off is Dimensional Barrier. Since they are almost exclusively an Xyz deck, and I'm pretty sure in the OCG they've only been playing maybe like 1 extra Link monster in the extra deck, If you activate Dimensional Barrier and call Xyz against them, it's probably going to be as effective as it was back in 2017 when Zodiac was the best deck and they only had access to Xyz monsters. So Dimensional Barrier is a huge blowout that you can pretty much side into any deck, and you might already be playing anyways because it's pretty good in the current metagame. If you made it this far into the video, I just want to ask you guys to please check if you're subscribed to the channel. As you can see, most of the people who watch my videos are not subscribed, and it would mean a lot to me if you can just quickly take a look to see if you're subscribed, because you may think you are, but there is a chance that you actually aren't. And by subscribing, you not only help to support the channel, but you also let me know that you guys enjoy this type of content, and it'll motivate me to keep making more of these videos in the future. But anyways, getting back to the video, the next deck I'm going to talk about is Maliss. So Maliss overall as a strategy is a very combo heavy deck that spams out a bunch of bodies out onto the board and takes full advantage of the Cyber's extra deck toolbox. The deck consists of a few main deck monsters which all have slightly different effects, but the main effect of these smaller monsters is that they get value when they're banished. So the Maliss deck will play cards like Gold Sarcophagus, as well as potentially Bystials in order to actually act as further extenders. They have a few Link monsters in their engine as well, and some of these Link monsters can be pretty solid. They have potential disruption effects on your opponent's turn, like Hearts of Cryptor, if you're able to summon them back out on your opponent's turn, and plus all the Link monsters also have the ability to bring themselves back when they're banished. So this deck can span out a ton of bodies on the board as long as they have an outlet to keep banishing cards, and that's pretty simple for the deck to accomplish. One of the ways they do this is with their in-engine trap cards, and these trap cards are very strong because you can actually activate them to turn their set by banishing a face-up Maliss monster. This is great for a couple of reasons. It allows the deck to play around targeting interruption like Imperm and Veiler, because they can simply set the trap card before they summon anything, and then as soon as they commit the monster to the board and you try to hit them with those cards, they can simply chain this to remove the monsters from the field and get full value. Not to mention, of course, banishing the monster also brings it back later on, so there isn't really much of a cost to these cards. There are a few of these trap cards in the archetype, and the one I've shown here is one of the trap cards that can disrupt your opponents, but the other trap cards can help them get into further engine to allow them to keep comboing and extending out onto the board. So even though these are trap cards, they don't really function like typical trap cards and are essentially like extra extenders in the deck. So what can the Maliss deck do? With Maliss, it's a little harder to pinpoint a specific typical end board because the deck can do so many different things, and it'll really depend on the hand and matchup they're going against. But when you go against this deck, you can pretty much always expect Firewall Dragon Dark Fluid to be on the board. This is one of the best Cyber's extra deck boss monsters. Since there are summoning restrictions in this deck, this is one of the best monsters for them to end on, because this is very simply going to dump a Cyber's to Save Worm on their own turn, which acts as a spell and trap negate as long as they control the Dark Fluid. Plus on the opponent's turn, they can send a Myriologic Aggregator to act as a Hot Red Dragon Archfiend and negate a face-up card. They will also take full advantage of the Cyber's extra deck toolbox, so they'll play cards like Firewall Dragon to either end on potentially, or they can use it as a combo extender to add pieces back from the graveyard to keep extending. Not to mention they have the Maliss Link monsters as well, all the FFX when they're summoned, and some of them can act as disruption like you saw earlier, and they have a bunch of ways to bring them back through their trap cards, for example. And then they might have some combination of the Maliss trap cards depending on the matchup or situation, because this is a pretty integral part of their engine and they will get to it quite often if they start playing. Not to mention, this deck is also similar to Ryzeal in the fact that it has strong one-card combos, so you can expect to see a lot of non-engine and hand traps in this deck. So on top of a big combo board, you're going to also have to deal with non-engine most likely. And finally, if that all wasn't enough, they're also going to pretty much have guaranteed follow-up every time. As soon as the monsters are banished and resummoned to the field, a lot of them have effects that give them more advantage and allow them to play during the next turn, even if you clear their board. But once again, do keep in mind, this deck is pretty flexible, but this is just one typical end board that you might see against this deck. So in terms of cards that beat Maliss, I was actually having a bit of a hard time finding huge blowouts other than these two. So Artifact Lancia in particular is very good against Maliss because all of their extension effects require them to banish monsters, and they lose out on so much value if they aren't able to banish cards during their turn, because they lose out on the extra bodies that they expect to generate throughout their turn as they play out their combo. And if you are able to hit them with Lancia, it is essentially a turn skip like Dimensional Barrier is for Ryzeal. So this is the other turn skip card that is going to be very good in this next format because of how strong it is against this deck. Fulos is also very good against this deck. They have a few effects as special summon from the deck, but this is a link spam deck, so they are going to go into the extra deck many times during their combo, so hitting them with Fulos is very strong and can make it very difficult. for them to extend and put up a decent board without giving you a bunch of draws. I'm sure there are some other floodgates that are pretty good against this deck, but when I was looking at what they were playing in the OCG, there didn't really seem to be anything aside from Lancia. And I guess I will preface that the reason that Lancia is pretty much the only floodgate that they're choosing to play is because in Ryzeal, Lancia is actually searchable, but I'm not really going to get too in depth on that. Overall, against Maliss, these two hand traps are pretty much going to be your best bet, at least for now. There may be some traditional floodgates that could hurt them as well, like Skill Drain, but it's key to note that they won't lose to cards like Dimensional Shifter or Dimensional Fissure, cards that would normally hurt these Cyber's combo decks a lot because they benefit off of being banished. So that's one thing the Maliss deck has going for it. It's pretty resilient to those banishing cards. The final deck I want to talk about is Ryu-Ge, and this one is definitely going to be less relevant than the other two. I don't think it's seen any results at all, so I'm not going to spend as much time on this. As far as I understand, this deck is essentially trying to set up a bunch of continuous spells with these level 10 monsters out onto the board and play a pretty slow control style of game. These gate continuous spells allow them to have some interruption on your turn, like for example this Serpent Fall gate will allow you to bounce one card on the field to the hand, which is fine I suppose, but this deck does generally just play more of a control style, setting up a few big bodies and then controlling the pace of the game with these gate cards. It was pretty hard to pinpoint a specific typical end board in this deck because when I was doing research for this video, it seemed like people were mixing this with a bunch of other engines, and as a pure deck, it was pretty hard to find like a pretty definitive combo, but some things you may expect to see are essentially 1 to 3 of their continuous gates. 2 of these gates have okay disruption effects, like one is a monster negate and one is a bounce, which is cool, and they'll probably be centered around getting those out onto the board with a Ryu-Ge monster and controlling the pace of the game from there. They are level 10 monsters as well, so you might expect to see a generic rank 10 somewhere in there, Varu just being pretty much the only relevant one that they would end on turn 1. And then once again, since this deck hasn't really been seeing much play and results, it was hard to find like a standard deck list, so I'm not too sure if they would choose to play hand traps, but you should probably assume that there will be hand traps in this type of deck because they are trying to control the pace of the game and slow it down so that they can slowly build advantage off their gates and their Ryu-Ge monsters. And then finally, I'm also not sure if this deck has follow-up. I would assume it has fairly good follow-up based on reading the cards alone, but once again, it was pretty hard to find a lot of information on this deck just because it wasn't really being played. Cards against the Ryu-Ge deck, this is mostly just based off of my intuition, since there haven't really been any guides on how to beat the deck or anything like that, but I feel like if you take out the gate cards, they're pretty good, and that takes out a couple of their key disruption points, and they'll have to rely on their non-engine in order to stop you once you remove their in-engine gates. Cards like Ghost Ogre seem pretty good because all the gates are continuous spells, and they have a Ritual Pendulum monster which will activate the skill to act as a Rhoda, and by hitting that, it can be pretty good as well, giving you additional copies of Ash Blossom essentially. And then finally, I assume board wipes like Evenly Match are pretty good because this deck doesn't seem to be able to put up an Omni Negate other than Varudras. So if you're able to clear out their back row of their gates plus potential floodgates, it can be pretty strong. So I think that against this deck, you probably want to focus on targeting their back row, but this is just theory and this could be subject to change depending on how people choose to play the deck here. Finally, how will these decks impact the upcoming meta, assuming we don't get a ban list? In my opinion, I think that Ryzeal and Maliss are going to be very solid tier 1 decks off the bat. Ryzeal has the strength of being able to play a bunch of hand traps and being pretty resilient to most of the hand traps in the meta, having ways to play around cards like Ghost Ogre and Nibiru, as well as not really being affected by cards like Dimensional Shifter. Plus, a deck like Maliss introduces another shifter deck into the format. This is also a very powerful combo deck, especially because we don't have Max C over here. There's going to be fewer ways to stop it from fully comboing for it very first turn, and for those reasons, I think that both of these decks are going to be solid tier 1 decks. Do I think they're going to take over the meta? Not necessarily, at least not until other decks get hit. But once other decks like Snake Eyes and Tempai get hit, I definitely think these will rise to the top of the metagame like they did in the OCG. But on release, if we don't get a ban list, these will just be solid tier 1 decks that will be able to compete with decks like Yubel, Snake Eyes, and Tempai. Now with the Ryu-Ge deck, I really don't even know if I want to put it at Rogue. I don't think the deck is very good just by reading the cards right now. I could be wrong on this, and this is mostly just speculation, but I think at most it would just be a Rogue deck that you don't really have to think too much about when you're preparing for tournaments. But to summarize the meta impact overall, I think that with the introduction of the Crossover Breaker set, this format's going to shift way heavier into a either play shifter or get shifter format. Because if you think about the decks that are in the metagame before this set comes out, the decks that can play shifter are Tempai and Ritual Beast mainly, but adding in Ryzeal and Maliss, there are now essentially 2 more decks that can play Shifter, and that means there's going to be a lot of Shifter running around. So if you're playing this metagame, you got to be prepared to either get hit with Dimensional Shifter and play a deck that either doesn't lose as hard to it or play outs the Dimension Shifter, or you're going to be playing a deck that plays Shifter itself, because like the 4 decks I mentioned that play Shifter are all pretty strong tier 1 contenders. So to sum it all up, I think that with the introduction of Crossover Breakers, we're going to get 2 new tier 1 decks, and it could be a nice change in the metagame because these 2 decks are pretty different than the ones that we have at the moment, which can make the format a little bit interesting. I don't think the format's going to get too degenerate aside from the fact that there's going to be a lot more Dimension Shifter running around, but I guess we will have to see once the set comes out. So if you guys enjoyed this video, let me know in the comment section below. I plan to make one for every single new set that's coming out into Yu-Gi-Oh! So you guys can get a glimpse into what the metagame might look like in a few weeks once that set is released. And once again, keep in mind that this is just speculation. The set isn't out yet, and things could change based on how players adapt over here and whether or not they reveal certain cards in the set. So do keep that in mind when watching this, but I hope you guys were able to learn something new, and with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.